Have you ever wondered what happens when a question you never dared to ask holds the answer to your entire life? For investigative journalist Maya Anderson, that question had haunted her for 7 years. It was a simple question with a universe of complicated answers. Why did the most brilliant professor she'd ever known, Dr. Alastair Finch, vanish from the world of academia without a trace? Maya believed some stories were never meant to be told until a rainy Tuesday in a forgotten corner of the city proved her wrong. Sometimes the most profound truths are hidden not in archives or interviews, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. Before we uncover this story of secrets and sacrifice, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. The scent of rain-soaked asphalt and old wood clung to the air as Maya pushed open the heavy oak door of the last chapter, a dusty, labyrinthine bookstore that seemed to exist outside of time. Rain lashed against the mullioned windows, turning the world outside into a watercolor blur. It was a place for forgotten stories, and Maya, chasing a lead on a completely unrelated case, felt a strange sense of homecoming. She navigated the narrow aisles, her fingers ghosting over the spines of leather-bound classics. She was looking for an obscure text on urban planning, a dry subject for a story she had little passion for. It was in the philosophy section, wedged between Plato and Kierkegaard, that she saw him. He was older, his once black hair now a distinguished salt and pepper, and fine lines were etched around his eyes, but it was unmistakably him, Dr. Alastair Finch, her former ethics professor. He was standing on a small ladder, carefully placing a book on a high shelf, his movements precise and deliberate. The man who once commanded a lecture hall of 300 students with the intellectual fire of a modern-day Socrates was now stocking shelves. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. 7 years. 7 years of wondering, of searching online forums and alumni networks, only to find dead ends. He had been a titan at the university, a revered scholar whose passion for moral philosophy had reshaped Maya's entire worldview. And then, one semester, he was just gone. His classes were reassigned, his office cleared out, and the university offered only a tight-lipped personal reasons as an explanation. Alastair descended the ladder, his back still to her. He wore a simple gray cardigan, worn at the elbows, a far cry from the tailored tweed jackets he used to favor. "Can I help you find something?" he asked, his voice the same resonant baritone that had once held her captivated, though it was softer now, quieter. Maya couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight, constricted by a tidal wave of memory. She remembered sitting in the front row of his class, hanging on, his every word about Kant and the categorical imperative. She remembered his intense, piercing gaze that seemed to see right through her, that made her feel both utterly exposed and completely understood. He turned, and his eyes, the same brilliant, intelligent blue, widened in recognition. The book he was holding, a collection of Stoic philosophy, slipped from his grasp and hit the worn wooden floor with a soft thud. "Maya?" He said her name like a ghost, a word from a life he'd long since buried. "Professor Finch," she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," he said, bending to retrieve the book, his movements stiff. Their fingers brushed as she instinctively reached to help him. A jolt, a spark of static electricity shot up her arm. It was the same electric current she used to feel when he'd hand back her papers, his fingers lingering on hers for a fraction of a second too long. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. I own this place now," he said, avoiding her gaze. "You own it?" Maya couldn't conceal her shock. But you're a tenured professor. You had a research grant, a book deal. Had, he corrected gently. I left the university. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy, with 7 years of unspoken questions. Maya stared at the man who had taught her that the unexamined life is not worth living, and all she could think was how unexamined his own departure had been. You left? She repeated, her mind struggling to reconcile the man before her with the intellectual giant she remembered. Why? You loved teaching. You were born for it. A shadow passed over his face, a fleeting glimpse of a deep, profound sorrow. He straightened up, creating a small, protective space between them. Things change, Maya. People make choices. But as he turned away, Maya saw it, a flicker of the same raw intensity that used to ignite their classroom debates about ethics and sacrifice, about the choices people make when love and duty collide. I remember your classes, Maya said softly, her voice filled with a nostalgia that ached. You made Aristotle feel like a personal friend. His shoulders tensed. That was a long time ago. Not that long, 7 years. Long enough. The silence that followed was a living thing, pulsing with the weight of everything left unsaid. Maya remembered staying after class, ostensibly to discuss her essays, but really just to be in his presence, to absorb his passion, to feel the pull of a connection she couldn't name. You look well, she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. He didn't look well. He looked tired, haunted. His laugh was a dry, hollow sound. I look like a man who runs a bookstore. You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world. Their eyes met across the narrow aisle, and for a fleeting moment, Maya saw past the quiet, reserved bookseller to the man beneath, vulnerable, guarded, and achingly familiar. I should go, he said, but his feet remained planted on the floor. Should you? The question was a challenge, a soft gauntlet thrown down in the dusty air. His fingers tightened on the book he was holding. Maya, please, don't. Don't what? Don't ask why the most brilliant man I've ever known is hiding in a bookstore. I'm not hiding. I'm living a quiet life, like you used to in class when you thought I wasn't watching you. The words slipped out, an admission that shocked them both. So he had seen it, the way she watched him, the way she hung on his every word. He had known. I was young, she whispered, a flush of heat rising in her cheeks. You were 21. I was 38. I was your professor. I'm not your student anymore. The declaration was a line drawn in the sand, a redefining of the terms that had once governed their entire world. His breath hitched. His knuckles were white against the book's spine. No, he said, his voice barely audible. You're not. The rain hammered against the windows, isolating them in their own private world. The bookstore suddenly felt charged, intimate, a confessional where 7 years of secrets were waiting to be spoken. What happened, Alistair? Really? Why did you leave? He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were shimmering with unshed tears, 'cause I couldn't do it anymore. Do what? Pretend. The word landed between them like a stone, sending ripples through the very fabric of Maya's understanding of their shared past. Pretend what? But even as the question formed in her mind, a part of her already knew the answer. It was in the way he had looked at her during class, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the way he had written pages of feedback on her essays that went far beyond academic critique. It was the same thing she had been pretending for 7 years, that the intellectual fire between them was just that, and not something deeper, something more dangerous, something that had the power to unravel them both. Alistair set the book down with a hand that trembled slightly. "I have to close up the shop. It's only 3 o'clock." "I know." But he made no move to escort her out. He just stood there, looking at her with an expression that was a heartbreaking mix of terror and longing. "I think about you sometimes," Maya admitted quietly, the confession feeling like a betrayal of the careful, professional life she had built. "Wonder what you're doing, if you're happy." "Don't," he whispered, his voice sharp with pain. "Why not?" "Because wondering is a dangerous game." "What's so dangerous about it?" His laugh was bitter this time. "Everything, absolutely everything." The bell above the door chimed, and a young couple entered, shaking rain from their coats. Alistair's professional mask slipped back into place instantly. "Welcome to the last chapter," he called out, but his eyes never left Maya's face. The spell was broken. The moment of raw vulnerability had passed, replaced by the mundane reality of commerce. "I should let you get back to work," Maya said, her voice flat. "Yes, you should." But neither of them moved. They were frozen in a tableau of unspoken words and unresolved motion. "Will you be here tomorrow?" Maya asked, the question feeling momentous. He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "I'm always here. Tomorrow's Wednesday." "I know. Maybe I'll come back. I'm still looking for that book on urban planning." "Maybe you shouldn't, but maybe I will anyway." His composure finally cracked, a tiny fissure in his carefully constructed fortress. "Maya, what do you want?" "The truth. Just be careful." "Of what?" But he had already turned away, busying himself with a stack of new arrivals, his shoulders rigid. Maya watched him for another moment, memorizing the way the silver in his hair caught the dim light, the slight stoop in his posture that hadn't been there 7 years ago. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the cool brass handle. "Alistair!" He looked up. "Yes. I'm glad I found you." She was out the door before he could respond, but not before she saw the way his hand flew to his chest, as if trying to still his racing heart. The cold November air was a shock to her system. She walked for blocks without direction, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and dawning realization. Alistair Finch. After 7 years, she had found him, and he had left everything, the career he loved, the life he had built, because he couldn't pretend anymore. Pretend what? The answer was there, shimmering just beneath the surface of her own memories. It was in the way her heart used to leap when he'd call on her in class. It was in the extra hours she'd pour into her essays hoping to impress him. It was in the profound sense of loss she had felt when he disappeared, a loss that went far beyond that of a student for a mentor. Maya stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, oblivious to the rain and the jostling crowds. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her editor. "Need to extend my trip. I've stumbled upon a new story." She hit send before she could change her mind. Tomorrow was Wednesday, and Maya Anderson had never been one to walk away from a story, especially not one that might finally provide the answer to the most important question of her life. Maya spent a sleepless night in her hotel room, the city lights of a strange place blurring through the rain-streaked window. Her mind was a chaotic archive of memories, each one re-examined in the stark new light of the afternoon's encounter. Dr. Finch? No, Alistair had left because he couldn't pretend. The words echoed, resonated, and unlocked chambers of her own heart she had kept sealed for 7 years. She remembered their last conversation with a startling, painful clarity. It was in his office, a sanctuary of books and quiet contemplation just days before her graduation. "Your final paper, Maya," he had said, his voice carefully neutral as he handed it back to her. "It's a truly exceptional piece of work." He hadn't just written comments in the margins. He'd included a 3-page, single-spaced letter analyzing her arguments, praising her insights, and in a way that felt deeply personal, reflecting on the moral courage she had demonstrated in her writing. "You see the world not just as it is, but as it ought to be," he had written. "That's a rare and precious gift. Don't ever let the cynicism of the world tarnish it." She had felt a blush creep up her neck as she read his words. "Thank you, Professor." "Alistair," he had corrected her gently, "I think after 4 years, you've earned the right." The shift had felt seismic. He had leaned forward then, his blue eyes intense, searching. "What will you do now, Maya, with all this passion and intellect?" The question felt bigger than just her career path. It felt like he was asking about her soul. Now, 7 years later, she understood. He hadn't just been asking as a mentor, he had been asking as a man who saw a future he couldn't be a part of. She arrived at the last chapter at 10 the next morning, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. She had rehearsed a dozen opening lines, but they all evaporated the moment she saw him. He was behind the counter, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, meticulously organizing a stack of receipts. He looked up as the bell chimed, and a flicker of something, was it panic or hope, crossed his face. "You came back. I said I would." He placed the receipts into a small wooden box with deliberate, measured movements. "Still looking for that urban planning text?" The formal tone was a shield, and she knew she had to break through it. "No," she said, walking closer to the counter. "Actually, I'm working on a piece about people who make radical life changes. People who walk away from successful careers to follow a different path. I was wondering if I could interview you." It was a plausible lie, a professional armor for her deeply personal quest. His expression shifted. The guard was still there, but now it was tinged with a cautious curiosity. "I'm not sure my story is that interesting." A celebrated academic leaving a tenured position at a top university to run a small bookstore? I think it's fascinating. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "All right," he said finally. "A few questions for your article." Maya pulled out her reporter's notebook, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. It was a role she could play, a way to create distance from the raw emotion churning inside her. "Why this bookstore?" she began. "It was my father's," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with memory. "He ran it for 40 years. When he passed away, I couldn't bear to sell it. It's the last piece of him I have." "So you've had it for a while?" "It's been in the family, yes. But I only started running it myself 7 years ago, the same year he left." Maya made a note, her hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Do you miss teaching?" The question was direct, and it hit its mark. His pen stilled. He looked away, out the window at the gray, rain-washed street. "Every single day," he said, the admission so quiet she almost missed it. The honesty of it hung between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. He quickly recomposed himself. "Next question." Maya studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders with a kind of rigid control. This was the man who had taught her about the courage of conviction, yet he seemed to be living a life of quiet retreat. What was the hardest part about leaving academia? He didn't answer right away. He walked over to a nearby shelf and straightened a row of books that were already perfectly aligned. "The silence," he said finally, his back still to her. "In a university, You're surrounded by a constant flow of ideas, of debate, of bright young minds challenging you. It's a symphony of intellectual energy. Here, it's quiet. The conversations are with authors who have been dead for centuries. And you prefer the quiet? He turned to face her, and his eyes were filled with a profound sadness. I didn't prefer it. I required it. Why? My reasons for leaving were personal, Maya. They aren't for public consumption, not even for a well-intentioned article. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. Maya knew she had to change tactics. What's your favorite book in the store? His expression softened almost imperceptibly. That's like asking a parent to choose a favorite child. There's always one, she countered with a small smile. He allowed himself a faint smile in return. Very well. If I had to choose, it would be Moby Dick. Why that one? She asked, genuinely curious. Because it's about a man consumed by an obsession so powerful it destroys him and everyone around him. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked passion. The subtext was so clear, it was practically text. He was talking about himself. He led her to the fiction section, to a shelf filled with different editions of the Melville Classic. As he reached for a worn, leather-bound copy, his sleeve rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his inner wrist. It was a single line of text in an elegant, almost calligraphic script. Maya leaned in, her journalistic instincts taking over. She recognized the words instantly. And my soul, from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted, nevermore. Alistair froze, his hand hovering over the book. You know Poe, the Raven, she said softly. You taught it in your Ethics in Literature seminar. It was one of my favorite classes. His hand moved instinctively, pulling his sleeve down to cover the tattoo. I got it a few years ago. A reminder. A reminder of what? That some shadows are permanent, that some losses are absolute. The words were a gut punch. He handed her the copy of Moby Dick, their fingers brushing again. This time, the contact lingered for a beat longer, a silent acknowledgement of the charge between them. Neither of them pulled away. Alistair, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what shadow are you living in? What did you lose? His composure, so carefully maintained, began to crumble. He looked around the empty store, a caged animal searching for an escape. You want the truth, Maya? The real truth, not some sanitized version for your article? I want the truth. He took a deep, shaky breath, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. I left because I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have. Someone it would have been a catastrophic moral failure to pursue, so I removed myself from the equation. Maya's heart stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face. Who? She breathed, but the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of another customer. Alistair turned away, his face a mask of profound relief at the interruption. Can I help you? He called out, his voice returning to its calm, professional cadence. Maya stood frozen by the bookshelf, his words echoing in the cavernous space of her mind. I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have. She watched him help the elderly woman find a gardening book, his movements calm, his voice gentle. This was the man she remembered, the kind, patient teacher. But now she saw the truth beneath the surface. A man in exile, a man who had sacrificed his entire world for a love he believed was forbidden. The customer left, and Alistair busied himself at the counter, deliberately avoiding her gaze. I should go, Maya said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears, probably for the best. But I'll be back. He looked up sharply, his blue eyes pleading. Maya, this isn't a good idea. Why not? Because it's dangerous? You already said that. Tomorrow's Thursday. The store is open until 9. This isn't a story you can just investigate and write. and then walk away from. Maybe not, she said, her hand on the doorknob. Maybe it's a story I have to live. As she opened the door, his voice, strained and quiet, stopped her. Maya, yes, the person I fell in love with, they never knew. I made sure of that. She turned slowly to face him. He was gripping the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, a man holding on for dear life. Are you sure about that? She asked softly. His breath hitched. For a moment, he looked just like he used to in his office, vulnerable, uncertain, and devastatingly human. I have to be, he whispered, because if I'm wrong, if they knew and didn't feel the same way, it would have destroyed me. The confession hung between them, a fragile bridge across 7 years of silence. And what if you're wrong about being wrong? She asked. He closed his eyes, a look of immense pain on his face. Then I've wasted 7 years of my life being a coward. It's not too late, is it? She wanted to scream. She wanted to march back to that counter, take his face in her hands, and tell him everything she had been too young and too intimidated to say back then. Instead, she just held his gaze. I'll see you Thursday, Alistair. She left before he could argue, before she could do something they would both regret. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world felt gray and unsteady. He had been in love with someone from the university, someone who never knew, but she had known. On some deep, intuitive level, she had always known. The way he would hold her gaze a second too long during a lecture, the way he would find reasons to praise her work in front of the class, the devastating sadness in his eyes on the day she graduated. They never knew. I made sure of that. But he was wrong. She had known. She had felt the powerful magnetic pull between them. She had just been too young, too afraid of misreading the signals, too in awe of him to ever believe it could be real. And now he thought he had suffered alone. Maya pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. She typed out a message. The person you fell in love with. What if they felt exactly the same way? She stared at the words, her heart pounded. Then, with a deep breath, she deleted the text. Some conversations had to happen face to face. Some truths required more courage than a text message could contain. And Maya Anderson was finally ready to be courageous. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Maya spent the next day in a fever of research, but her investigation had nothing to do with urban planning or radical life changes. She was digging into the past, into the professional life of Dr. Alistair Finch. She called old university contacts, feigning a "Where Are They Now" piece for an alumni magazine. The story was always the same. Finch, brilliant mind, a huge loss to the department. He left for personal reasons, I believe, very sudden, never saw it coming. A real tragedy. He was on track to be one of the greats. It was her conversation with Dr. Eleanor Vance, a retired history professor and Alistair's former mentor, that finally cracked the official narrative. Alistair was different that last year, Eleanor said over a crackling phone line from her home in Vermont. He seemed conflicted, distracted. Conflicted how? Maya pressed, her reporter's instincts on high alert. Like he was at war with himself. He'd always been so engaged, so present, but suddenly he was distant. He resigned from 2 university committees, turned down a keynote speaking engagement, and his teaching evaluations. Eleanor paused. They were still impeccable, of course. The students adored him, but some of the comments were odd. Odd how? Maya's pulse quickened. Students mentioned how emotional he seemed in class. One wrote that Dr. Finch seemed to be teaching from a place of deep personal pain, especially when discussing works about forbidden love or sacrifice. Another said it felt like he was working out his own ethical dilemmas in front of them. Do you remember which semester that was? Maya asked, her hand trembling as she wrote in her notebook. Spring of 2018, his last semester with us. Eleanor's voice grew softer, more curious. Maya, why are you really asking about this? This feels more personal than a simple alumni feature. Maya offered a vague professional deflection, but Eleanor's words echoed in her mind long after the call ended. Spring of 2018. The semester she graduated, the semester after which he disappeared. He had stayed one more semester after she left, a semester of teaching from a place of pain, a semester of wrestling with his own ethics in a public forum. Had he been trying to teach himself how to let her go? The thought was both devastating and profoundly moving. Thursday evening arrived, draped in a cold, clear twilight. The lights of the last chapter cast a warm, inviting glow onto the street. Maya stood across from it for a full 10 minutes, gathering her courage like a shield. When she finally walked in, the bell chiming softly, Alistair was at the back of the store, organizing the poetry section. He looked up, and the expression on his face was one of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting her, dreading this inevitable confrontation. You're back. I keep my promises. He placed a slim volume of Rilke back on the shelf with painstaking care. What do you want from me, Maya? The question was blunt, stripped of all pretense. It demanded an equal honesty. I want to understand, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Understand what? Why a man chose a quiet life over a stressful one? It's not that complicated. Why you left the place you belonged. Why you look like you've been mourning for 7 years. This isn't a quiet life, Alistair. It's an exile. His composure finally shattered. You don't know anything about my life. Then tell me. Help me understand why you threw it all away. They stared at each other down the long, narrow aisle, the silent stories of 1,000 authors bearing witness to their own unfolding drama. He looked exhausted, like a man who had been fighting a war for a very long time and had finally reached the point of surrender. There's nothing to understand. I made a choice, and I'm living with the consequences. What choice? He turned away, but she moved to stand in front of him, blocking his path. What choice, Alistair? The choice to leave, he said, his voice ragged, before I did something I would regret for the rest of my life. Like what? He wouldn't meet her eyes. She saw the flash of pain, the flicker of a truth he could no longer contain, like falling in love with a student. The words, when they finally came, were a physical blow. There it was. The truth they had been circling for 2 days, for 7 years. It was real. Alistair, she began, her own voice choked with emotion. Don't, he said sharply, cutting her off. Don't say whatever you're thinking. You don't know what it was like. Then explain it to me. He let out a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. Explain what? How I spent 4 years watching you grow from a bright-eyed freshman into a formidable intellectual? How I looked forward to your essays more than any academic journal? How every time you raised your hand in class, I felt a jolt, knowing you were about to challenge me to make me better. Each word was a confession, torn from a place of deep, long-held pain. Maya stood frozen, the air growing thin around her as he finally gave voice to the truth she had only ever suspected, had never dared to believe. How I had to grip the sides of my lectern to stop myself from reaching out and brushing a stray strand of hair from your face. How I wrote your letters of recommendation and felt like I was writing my own eulogy, because I was sending away the only person who made my world feel vibrant and real. Tears were streaming down his face now, unchecked. How I watched you walk across that graduation stage and wanted to stand up and scream for you to stay, but knowing I was the one person who had to let you go. How I spent the next semester trying to teach Plato's Symposium, and all I could hear was your voice, your brilliant arguments about the nature of love. He finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed, but blazing with the intensity she remembered. How I realized I couldn't do it anymore, because every student who sat in the front row just reminded me of you, and it wasn't fair to them. It wasn't fair to the memory of you. It wasn't fair to me. To me, Maya finished for him, her voice a whisper. He nodded, wiping at his tears with a shaking hand. And to you, because you deserved a mentor who could guide your future, not someone who was falling apart every time you smiled. The silence that descended was profound, filled with the weight of 7 years of sacrifice. You left because of me, she stated, the reality of it settling into her bones. I left because of me, he corrected, because I couldn't trust myself. I was your professor. I held power over you, over your future. And my feelings, they were a complete and utter abuse of that power. Alistair, look at me. I can't. Please, slowly, painfully, he raised his eyes to meet hers. They were the same brilliant blue, now swimming in a sea of regret. You weren't the only one, she said softly. He blinked, confusion clouding his features. What? You weren't the only one falling apart. You weren't the only one who looked forward to those conversations. You weren't the only one who felt something that had absolutely no place in a classroom. He shook his head in denial. Don't say that just to be kind. I'm not being kind, she insisted, taking a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. I'm being honest. For the first time in 7 years. You were 21. You had your whole life, your whole future. I was 21 and hopelessly in love with my ethics professor. I was 21 and wrote papers that were secretly love letters, hoping you'd see the real questions I was asking between the lines. I was 21 and I stayed after class every single time just to hear you say my name one more time. His hands were trembling. Maya, stop. I was 21 and in love with you, Alistair, completely, devastatingly in love. The words, her own confession, hung in the air, a perfect, symmetrical echo of his own. He closed his eyes, his face a mask of anguish and disbelief. You can't possibly know what you're saying. I know perfectly. I knew then too. I just didn't have the courage or the vocabulary to say it. I didn't know what to do with it. There was nothing to do. It was impossible. But it's not impossible anymore. His eyes snapped open. What? You're not my professor anymore. I'm not your student. We're just two people. Two adults who what? Who wasted 7 years being terrified. She finished for him. Who found each other in a dusty bookstore on a rainy Tuesday. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond pain. It was hope. A fragile, tentative, terrifying hope. This is insane, he whispered. Probably, she agreed, but insane doesn't mean it isn't true. I'm 45 now, Maya. You're 28. My life is this. He gestured around the quiet, dusty store. I have nothing to offer you. You're brilliant and kind and the most honorable man I've ever known. You sacrificed everything because you thought it was the right thing to do. You taught me how to think. You taught me how to argue. You taught me what it means to live an ethical life. You made me fall in love with ideas. You made me fall in love with you. His composure finally crumbled completely. He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and covered his face with his hands. I thought about you every day, he whispered through his fingers. every single day for 7 years. Maya reached out, her own hands trembling, and gently pulled his away from his face. So did I. They stood there, hands clasped between them, the accumulated weight of 7 years of longing finally finding its voice. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice raw. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we figure it out. Together." His smile was watery, but it was the first real smile she had seen on his face. "I can't believe you're really here. I can't believe you feel the same way. I can't believe you left everything because of me." "Because of us," he corrected softly. "Because of what I felt for you. Do you regret it?" He considered the question with the serious intellectual rigor she had always admired. "I regret the pain. I regret the years we lost. But I don't regret protecting you. An academic relationship, a power imbalance like that, it could have damaged your future, your career. I couldn't risk that. Your future was more important than my feelings." Maya squeezed his hands. "You are a good man, Alistair Finch. Not good enough to stop myself from falling in love with you. Thank God for that," she whispered. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that transformed his face, erasing years of sadness. It was the laugh she remembered from the classroom, the one that made his eyes sparkle. "So what now?" he asked again, the hope in his voice stronger now. "Now we take it slow. We get to know the people we've become. We see if this thing between us is real, or if it's just nostalgia for a past that could never be." "It's real," he said with an immediate, unshakable certainty. "At least it is for me. For me too, but we still take it slow." He nodded. "Slow is good. Slow is wise. Can I take you to dinner tomorrow night?" His smile was radiant, a sunrise after a long, dark night. "I would like that very much." "It's a date then." "A date," he repeated, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. "I haven't been on a date and I don't even remember." "Neither have I," she admitted. "Not a real one." They stood there, grinning at each other like teenagers, their hands still linked, a bridge across 7 years of silence finally built and fortified. The bell chimed as a late customer entered, shattering their private world. Alistair stepped back, but he didn't let go of her hand. "I should go," Maya said, reluctant to leave. "I'll just browse for a bit." She spent the next hour wandering through the aisles, pretending to read book jackets, but really, she was just watching him. She watched the way he helped the customer, the way his face lit up as he talked about a favorite author, the gentle way he handled the old books. He hadn't been diminished by this quiet life. He had been transformed. He had found a different way to share his passion, a way that didn't carry the impossible weight of their shared past. As closing time approached, he walked over to where she was sitting in the philosophy section. "Find anything you like?" She held up a copy of Plato's Symposium, just revisiting an old friend. His cheeks flushed slightly. "I may have reread that a few times myself over the years." "Any particular reason?" "Research," he said with a wry smile. "For a personal project on the nature of love." Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't push. They would have time for all their secrets now. "I should let you lock up," she said, standing. "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Perfect. Where should I pick you up?" He hesitated. "Actually, could we meet there? My apartment? I'm not quite ready for..." "Of course," she said, understanding. "How about that little Italian place on Beacon Hill, Giovanni's?" "Perfect." They walked to the door together, the comfortable silence of the day's revelations settling around them. "Maya," he said, as she was about to leave. "Yes?" "Thank you for coming back, for not giving up on the question." She reached out and squeezed his hand one last time. Some stories are worth fighting for. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, he repeated, the word full of promise. As Maya walked away into the crisp night air, she heard the lock click behind her. But when she glanced back over her shoulder, Alistair was still standing in the window, watching her go. And for the first time in 7 years, Maya felt like she was walking toward her future, not away from her past. Maya changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple navy blue dress. It was elegant, but understated, a statement of quiet confidence. She wanted to look beautiful for him, but more than that, she wanted to feel like herself, the 28-year-old woman she had become, not the 21-year-old student he remembered. She was so nervous her hands were shaking. At 5 minutes to 7, she was standing outside Giovanni's, a cozy restaurant tucked away on a cobblestone side street. She saw him through the window, already seated at a quiet corner table. He was reading a book, of course, and even in the dim, romantic lighting of the restaurant, he looked magnificent. He wore a dark blazer over a crisp white shirt, and his hair was neatly combed. He looked less like a dusty bookseller and more like the distinguished professor she had first known. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and went inside. "Sorry if I'm late," she said, sliding into the chair opposite him. "You're not late at all. I'm just habitually early." It was a nervous habit, she knew. He closed his book, a well-worn copy of Persuasion by Jane Austen, and smiled at her. Outside the bookstore, he seemed different, softer, less burdened. "Good choice," Maya said, nodding at the book. "I was just rereading the ending, the part about second chances. It seemed appropriate." Their eyes met over the flickering candlelight. "And sometimes," Maya said softly, continuing the theme, "you get a second chance to get it right." His smile was breathtaking. "Sometimes you do." They ordered a bottle of wine, and for the first hour, they talked about everything and nothing. They talked about books and politics and the changing face of journalism. They carefully, deliberately avoided the 7-year elephant in the room. It was as if they were trying to build a new foundation to get to know the people they were now before they tried to excavate the past. "Tell me about your work," he said, his expression one of genuine, rapt attention. "Are you happy?" "Most of the time," she answered honestly. "I love the chase, the puzzle of a good story. But sometimes I miss the depth. I miss spending months on a single idea, the way we did in your seminars. You could always go back, get your doctorate." She shook her head. "I considered it right after graduation, but the academic world felt too contained. I wanted to be out in the world, telling stories that could actually change things." He nodded in understanding. "I know that feeling. Toward the end, I often felt like I was in an echo chamber at the university, preaching to the converted. The real ethical battles are fought out here." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "Not in a lecture hall." "But you change things," she insisted. "You changed me." "How?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Maya thought for a moment, wanting to give him the truest answer. "You taught me that ethics aren't a set of abstract rules. They're a living, breathing thing that you have to wrestle with every single day. You taught me that the hardest choices are never between right and wrong, but between 2 different rights." She paused, taking a sip of wine. "You taught me how to fall in love with a question." The unspoken question between them hung in the air, rich and potent. "That too," she whispered. Their main courses arrived, a welcome interruption to the escalating intensity. They talked about his bookstore, her recent articles, their families, the small, mundane details of the lives they had lived apart. It was comfortable, easy, and yet fraught with the powerful undercurrent of everything they weren't saying. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as they shared a tiramisu. Leaving, he was quiet for a long time, swirling the last of the wine in his glass. "I regret the circumstances that forced my hand," he said carefully. "But the act of leaving itself, no. In some ways, I'm more myself now than I ever was." "How so?" "There's less pressure, less performance, and," he hesitated, then met her gaze directly, "I don't have to pretend anymore. About who I am, about what I want." "And what do you want, Alistair?" He reached across the table and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Right now, I want this dinner. I want this conversation. I want the chance to get to know Maya Anderson, the brilliant journalist, the remarkable woman. As for what comes after that, I'm trying not to think too far ahead. It's terrifying enough just being here with you now." She squeezed his hand. "We don't have to have it all figured out tonight." "I know, but I can't help but wonder, what if this is a mistake? What if the reality of us can't possibly live up to the 7 years of memory?" "And what if it can?" she countered gently. "What if this is exactly what we've both been waiting for?" He smiled, the familiar crinkles appearing at the corners of his eyes. "You're an optimist, and you're a pessimist." "I prefer the term realist, and I prefer optimist." They laughed, and the tension that had been building between them eased. "Walk with me?" he asked as they left the restaurant. They strolled through the gas-lit streets of Beacon Hill, their hands now linked loosely between them. The November air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and the promise of winter. "I have a confession to make," he said, his voice quiet as they paused to look out over the glittering city skyline. "What is it?" "I kept all of your papers from every class you ever took with me." Maya stopped walking, her heart skipping a beat. "You did?" "I know I shouldn't have. It was a breach of academic protocol. I should have shredded them when I cleared out my office, but I couldn't. They were too brilliant, too much a part of you." "Where are they now?" "In a box, in my apartment, along with—" He trailed off, his voice catching. "Along with what?" "Things I wrote after you left." "What kind of things?" "Poems," he admitted, his face flushing in the dim light. "Terrible, sentimental, unpublished poems about forbidden love and impossible choices." Maya's heart ached with a deep, tender love for this man. "It's not pathetic, Alistair. It's human. You haven't read them." "I don't need to. The fact that you wrote them, that's enough." They resumed walking, turning onto a quiet, tree-lined street. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "That last day in your office, when I came to say goodbye, you looked like you wanted to say something else, something more than just good luck." He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "I wanted to tell you," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "that you were, without exception, the most extraordinary student I had ever had the privilege of teaching, that your mind was a rare and beautiful thing." He stopped walking and turned to face her under the soft glow of a street lamp. "But I also wanted to tell you that I was going to miss you more than was appropriate, that I looked forward to your insights in class like a man dying of thirst looks forward to water, that I reread your papers not to grade them, but because I loved the way your mind worked. I wanted to tell you that you had reawakened a passion in me, not just for teaching, but for life itself. that you had made me remember why I fell in love with philosophy in the first place. Why didn't you? She whispered, her own eyes filling with tears. Because it would have been selfish. It would have put an impossible burden on you. You were graduating. You were starting your life. The last thing you needed was your professor confessing his inappropriate feelings and complicating your future. What if I wanted my future to be complicated by you? You were 21, Maya. You didn't know what you wanted. I knew I wanted you. The words, so simple, so true, hung in the air between them. His breath caught. You couldn't have, couldn't I? I took every class you offered. I wrote papers designed to impress you. I chose topics I hoped would interest you. I hung on every single word you said. You were a dedicated student. I was a student who was completely in love with her professor. He closed his eyes, a pained expression on his face. Don't say that. Why not? It's the truth. Because it makes everything I did, every choice I made, feel even more wrong. You didn't do anything wrong, she insisted, stepping closer. You were honorable. You were ethical. You protected both of us from a situation that could have destroyed us. I fantasized about you. I wrote poetry about you. I counted down the minutes until your next class. And I did the same thing, she confessed. We were both human, Alistair. We both felt something powerful and real that we couldn't act on. That doesn't make us wrong. It just makes us careful. He opened his eyes and she could see the tears shimmering there. I was so afraid, he whispered. Of what? Of ruining you, of taking advantage, of becoming a cautionary tale, the professor who couldn't control himself. You did control yourself. You were perfect. I was miserable. So was I. But we got through it, and we're here now. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the truth of her words for the first time. We're here now. They had stopped in front of a small, elegant park. He led her to a wrought iron bench beneath a large oak tree. I need to tell you something else, he said, his voice shaky. I'm scared. In fact, I'm terrified. Of what? Of this. Of you. Of the way my heart feels like it's going to beat out of my chest every time I look at you. I haven't been in a relationship in a decade. I've been so focused on my work, on my solitude, on keeping my feelings locked down, that I'm not sure I know how to be vulnerable with another person anymore. She took both of his hands in hers. We'll figure it out together. We'll be patient with each other. This is new for both of us. You're not damaged. I am. Am I not? I've spent 7 years comparing every man I've ever dated to a memory of you. I've sabotaged potential relationships because no one could ever measure up to the ghost of my brilliant, unattainable professor. His eyes widened in surprise. You dated? I tried. It never lasted. They weren't you. He stared at her, a look of wonder on his face. Maya, I had no idea. I know it's not healthy to build your life around a fantasy, but I couldn't help it. You were the standard. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared confessions settling around them. So, what do we do now? He asked again, his voice softer this time. Now we try, she said. We see if the reality of us can be even better than the fantasy. And if it can't, then at least we'll know. At least we won't spend the next 40 years wondering, what if? He smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile. You really are an optimist. And you, she said, leaning closer, are really worth the risk. He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, he just rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For finding me. for not giving up, for being brave enough to ask the questions I was too afraid to answer. Thank you for being worth finding. They sat like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same crisp night air. It felt like a beginning. I should get you home, she said eventually. I can take the T. I'll walk you to the station. They walked back to the main street slowly, reluctantly. Can I see you again? She asked as they reached the subway entrance. I'd be deeply disappointed if you didn't ask. Tomorrow? He laughed. Eager, aren't you? I've waited 7 years. I'm done being patient. Tomorrow I'm working until 6, but after that, I'll be waiting. He smiled, and then, before she could react, he leaned in and kissed her cheek. It was brief, chaste, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. Good night, Maya. Good night, Alistair. She watched him until he disappeared down the subway stairs. Then she turned and walked back to her hotel, a smile on her face that she couldn't suppress. For the first time in 7 years, the future felt vast and full of incandescent possibility. The storm that rolled into the city the next evening was sudden and ferocious. One moment, Maya was walking toward the last chapter under a bruised twilight sky. The next, the heavens opened up and a torrential downpour began. She spent the day trying to focus on her actual work, filing 2 stories and conducting 3 phone interviews, but her mind was a constant hum of Alistair. At 5:45, she gave up the pretense and headed for the bookstore. She arrived soaked and breathless, pushing open the door to a gust of wind that sent papers fluttering from the front counter. Alistair looked up from where he was helping a customer, and his face broke into a smile so warm it made her forget the cold rain. You're early, he said, once the customer had departed. I couldn't concentrate. Kept thinking about last night. Good thoughts, I hope. The very best. A faint blush colored his cheeks. Even after all the confessions, he still seemed endearingly surprised by her directness. I have about 15 minutes left to close up, he said. I'll wait. She settled into a worn leather armchair near the philosophy section, the one she was already starting to think of as her chair. She watched him work, mesmerized by the quiet competence of his movements. He recommended a new biography to a young student, helped an elderly man find a book on Roman history, and rang up sales with a genuine, gentle warmth. This was Alistair in his element, not the tortured academic she had first seen, but a man at peace with his new life. The rain intensified, drumming against the large bay windows like a frantic heartbeat. By 6 o'clock, it was a full-blown thunderstorm, with flashes of lightning illuminating the dark street outside. Ready to make a swim for it? He asked, pulling on a dark wool coat. Maya looked at the sheets of rain cascading down the glass. Maybe we should wait it out for a few minutes. Good idea, he said, a look of relief on his face. He flipped the sign on the door to closed and locked it. Suddenly, they were alone, cocooned in the warm, dry, book-scented world he had created. The only sounds were the rain and the soft hum of the old radiator. Cozy, Maya said. Very. He seemed nervous again, the easy confidence of the bookseller replaced by a familiar uncertainty. Are you okay? She asked gently. It's just, this feels very intimate. Being here alone with you after hours. She understood completely. The bookstore felt different now, smaller, more private, a secret world that belonged only to them. We could just talk, she suggested. Get to know each other better. What do you want to know? Everything. What you were like as a kid, what book first made you fall in love with ideas, what you dream about now. He laughed softly, a low, melodic sound. That's a tall order. We have time, she said, gesturing toward the storm-battered windows. "This doesn't look like it's going anywhere." They settled into two armchairs facing each other, a small table between them. "I was a quiet child," he began, his voice taking on a reminiscent tone. "Always reading, always asking questions that made the adults in my life uncomfortable." "What kind of questions? Why do people say they believe one thing but do another? Is it possible to be a good person in a bad world? Why do the saddest songs sound the most beautiful?" Maya smiled. "You were always destined to be a philosopher." "I suppose so, though I wanted to be a novelist first. What happened to that dream?" His expression grew wistful. Reality, academia, the pressure to publish scholarly articles instead of fiction. I told myself I'd get back to it someday, but someday has a way of never arriving. "Until you left the university." He nodded. "Yes, I've been writing again, just for myself. Not very good, I'm afraid. I'd love to read it sometime. Maybe, if I ever work up the courage." The storm continued to rage. Alistair disappeared into the small back office and returned with two steaming mugs of tea. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments, just listening to the rain. "Your turn," he said, his eyes warm over the rim of his mug. "Tell me about your childhood." "Loud," she said with a laugh. "Chaotic. I'm the youngest of four. I learned very early that if you want to be heard, you have to have the most compelling story." "Is that why you became a journalist?" "Partly, but mostly because I'm insatiably curious. I want to understand what makes people tick, why they make the choices they do." "And do you understand now?" "Some days I think I do. Other days people are a complete and total mystery." He smiled. "Including me?" "Especially you. You're the most complex and fascinating story I've ever encountered." "Complex is just a polite word for complicated." "I like complicated. Simple stories are never the interesting ones." They talked for hours as the storm swirled around their sanctuary. He told her about his lonely years in graduate school, about the politics of academic life, about the profound joy he felt the first time a student challenged one of his core beliefs. She told him about her first big story, about the interviews that had changed her, about the constant struggle to remain objective in a world that demanded empathy. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked as they shared a packet of biscuits he'd found in the office. "The intellectual sparring, the conferences in foreign cities, the feeling of being at the center of the conversation." "Sometimes," he admitted. "I miss the stimulation, but I don't miss the pressure. I don't miss the constant feeling that I had to have all the answers, and I don't miss the ethical tightrope I was walking every single day." "Because of me?" "Because of my feelings for you," he corrected gently. "Because I couldn't trust my own objectivity anymore. Every grade I gave you, every piece of advice, I had to second guess my motives. It was exhausting." Maya leaned forward, her voice soft. "Can I ask you something that might be difficult?" "You can ask me anything." "Were there others before me? Other students you felt a connection with?" He shook his head immediately, his expression unequivocal. "Never, not once in 15 years of teaching. You were different." "How?" "You didn't just understand the ideas, you felt them. You wrestled with them. You challenged me not just as a professor, but as a person. You made me question everything I thought I knew about myself." "Like what?" "Like my capacity for love. I'd had relationships, of course, but nothing consuming. Nothing that made me understand why the great poets wrote about love as if it were a form of divine madness. Maya's heart clenched. "And I made you understand that. You made me understand everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Why people sacrifice their careers, their reputations, their entire lives for a single person. Why a rational man would make the most irrational choice of his life. Why someone would rather live in a self-imposed exile than risk tarnishing something he held sacred. The rain had softened to a gentle, rhythmic patter on the roof, but neither of them was in any hurry to leave. "Alistair," she said softly, "can I tell you something?" "Anything?" "I used to fantasize about this exact scenario, about being trapped somewhere with you, where we could just talk, without the titles of professor and student hanging over us." His breath caught. "You did?" "All the time. I'd imagine running into you in a library during a snowstorm, or a coffee shop during a blackout, or," she gestured around them, "a bookstore in a thunderstorm." "What happened in these fantasies?" "We'd talk for hours, and you'd finally see me, not just as a student, but as an equal, as a person worth knowing." "Oh, Maya," he said, his voice full of a tender regret, "you were always worth knowing. Even then, you were extraordinary. But you couldn't tell me that, not in the way you wanted to." "No, I couldn't." They looked at each other across the small table, 7 years of unspoken feelings finally laid bare. "Can I tell you what I wanted to say on that last day?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he took a shaky breath. "I wanted to tell you that you had changed my life, that teaching you had been the single greatest privilege of my professional career. I wanted to tell you that I was so incredibly proud of you, not just for your intellect, but for your integrity, your compassion, your fierce moral courage." Maya felt tears welling in her eyes. "And I wanted to tell you," he continued, his voice breaking, "that I was falling in love with you. And it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing that had ever happened to me." The words, finally spoken, filled a quiet space between them. "I wanted to hear that so badly," she whispered. "I wanted to say it so badly it felt like it was killing me. And now I'm terrified all over again, because this isn't a fantasy anymore. This isn't a what if. This is real. This is you and me right here, with a chance to actually try." Maya stood up and moved to the armchair next to his. She took his hand. "Are you ready to try?" "I don't know, are you?" "I've been ready for 7 years." He reached out with his free hand and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "You're so beautiful," he whispered. "I used to try so hard not to notice." "So are you. You always have been." He leaned closer, and this time she knew he wasn't going to pull away. The air crackled with anticipation. Is this okay?" he asked, his lips just inches from hers. "It's more than okay," she breathed. He kissed her then. It was a soft, tentative kiss at first, a question, and then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming a conversation, a story, a release of 7 years of pent-up longing, regret, and hope. It was gentle and passionate, hesitant and certain, all at once. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. "Wow," Maya whispered. "Wow," he agreed, his forehead resting against hers. They sat like that for a long moment, just breathing each other in. "I can't believe we just did that," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. "I can't believe it took us this long." He laughed, and the sound was pure, unadulterated joy. "So, we're really doing this, aren't we?" "If you want to." "I want to. God, I want to so much it scares me." "Then we're doing this. Outside, The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world clean and glistening, but neither of them moved. They were in no hurry to leave the sanctuary they had found. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we see where this goes, one day at a time." "One kiss at a time?" he asked, a playful glint in his eye. She smiled. "If you're lucky." He kissed her again, longer this time, with more confidence, more certainty. When they broke apart, his eyes were shining. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what now?" "For being patient, for not giving up, for making me believe in second chances." "Thank you," she replied, "for being worth waiting for." They held each other in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by the silent testament of 1,000 love stories, finally beginning to write their own. 3 weeks later, Maya's Boston assignment had been extended indefinitely. Her editor was confused, but Maya had pitched him a compelling long-form series on the decline of independent bookstores that was just plausible enough to be convincing. The truth was, she couldn't leave. Not now. Not when her own story was just beginning. She and Alistair had been taking it slow, just as they'd promised. They went for long walks along the Charles River, had quiet dinners in neighborhood restaurants, and spent hours in the bookstore after closed talking. He was slowly, cautiously letting her in. He shared stories from his past, his hopes for the future, the pieces of himself he had kept locked away for years. But there were still walls. He hadn't invited her to his apartment. Their kisses were tender, passionate, and left her breathless. But they always stopped short of going further. He was still holding a part of himself back, a final secret chamber she hadn't been allowed to enter. Maya was trying to be patient, to give him the space he needed, but the waiting was a quiet agony. "You seem distracted," he said one crisp December afternoon as they sat on a bench in the public garden watching skaters glide across the frozen pond. "Sorry," she said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." She hesitated. They had been so honest with each other about everything else. It was time to be honest about this. "I'm thinking about you, about us, about the fact that sometimes it feels like you're still keeping me at arm's length." He stopped stirring his coffee, his gaze fixed on the ice. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've never seen where you live. You change the subject whenever I ask about the novel you're writing. You kiss me like you're half expecting me to vanish into thin air." "Maybe I am," he said quietly. "Why would I vanish?" He turned to her then, and the look in his eyes was one of deep, profound fear. "Because when you see all of me, Maya, the real, unedited, obsessive truth of me, you might realize this isn't what you want. You might run." Maya's heart ached for him. "What could you possibly show me that would make me run?" "The evidence," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "of how far gone I was, of how much of my life I built around the memory of you. Alistair, my apartment is filled with first editions of every author you ever mentioned in class. I have copies of every academic paper you ever published. I used to write your name in the margins of my notebooks like a lovesick teenager." His voice was getting smaller, filled with shame. "I kept a folder on my laptop of your papers. I'd reread them whenever I felt lost. I set up a Google alert for your name. I followed your career obsessively." She felt a wave of overwhelming tenderness. "Oh, Alistair, you see? Your expression just changed. You're looking at me differently. I'm looking at you with love and with recognition." "Recognition? You think you're the only one who is obsessed? I have a file of your articles, too. I bought books I had no interest in just because you recommended them. After graduation, whenever I had a work trip to Boston, I would drive past the university hoping for a chance glimpse of you. I almost came to your office 100 times, but I always lost my nerve at the last minute. Really? He asked, his voice filled with a stunned disbelief. Really? We were both a little crazy, Alistair. That doesn't make us pathetic. It just means we were in love and didn't know what to do with it. He was quiet for a long time, processing her words. I want to show you, he said finally, but I'm terrified. What is it? My apartment? My writing? The proof of just how completely I had built a world around a memory. She took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. I want to see it, all of it, even if it's messy and embarrassing, especially then. I don't want the perfect, idealized professor from my memories, Alistair. I want you, the real, human, beautifully complicated you. He squeezed her hand, a look of resolve on his face. Okay, but don't say I didn't warn you. His apartment was on the top floor of a Beacon Hill brownstone, a cozy book-filled space with high ceilings and a fireplace. It was exactly as she had imagined it, warm, intellectual, and slightly chaotic in the most charming way. Can I get you some wine? He asked, his hands visibly shaking as he took her coat. Please. He poured them both a glass of red wine, his movements stiff and awkward. The writing is in my study, in a box, a very cliché box, I'm afraid. Alistair, breathe, it's just me. That's precisely why it's so terrifying. He disappeared into a book-lined study and returned a moment later carrying a worn wooden chest. He set it on the coffee table with the reverence of a man handling a sacred relic. 7 years of maudlin poetry and navel-gazing journal entries about a student I had no right to even think about. He said, his voice tight. Are you sure you want to do this? I'm sure. With a deep breath, he opened the chest. Inside were dozens of notebooks, loose papers, and what looked like manuscript pages covered in his familiar, elegant script. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to her, his hand trembling. This was the first one. I wrote it the night after your graduation. Maya unfolded the paper. The poem was titled The Last Lecture. She walked across the stage, a flash of black and red, and I, among the cheering crowd, felt something in me dead. The chapter closed, the book was shut, the story at an end, and the hollow space she left behind, no scholarship could mend. I wanted to call out her name, to say what I should not, to confess the truth that burned in me, the lesson I'd forgot, that all the ethics in the world and all the ancient texts cannot explain the simple, devastating way the heart connects. Maya felt tears spring to her eyes. Alistair, this is beautiful. It's sentimental nonsense. The meter is a disaster. It's honest. It's real. It's you. He pulled out another sheaf of papers. This is worse. It's a chapter from the novel I was trying to write. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice shaky. He saw her across the crowded faculty reception, a ghost from a life he was no longer permitted to live. She was talking to the new department head, her face animated, her arguments as sharp and brilliant as they had always been in his classroom. He had taught her everything he knew about moral philosophy, and in return, she had taught him the singular, devastating truth that some feelings are so profound they defy all ethical frameworks. To love her was a moral failing, but not to love her, he was beginning to realize, was a failure of the soul. He stopped reading, unable to continue. You kept writing about me, about us. It was the only story I knew how to write. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal. This is the worst of it. My journal from that last semester after you left. He opened it to a bookmarked page. October 12th. I tried to teach Kant's categorical imperative today. A student asked me, if a moral absolute could ever be compromised by love. I saw her face in my mind, heard her voice asking the same question 2 years prior. I nearly choked on the hypocrisy. Here I was, espousing the virtues of universal moral law, when my own heart was a lawless, ungovernable territory, and she was its only sovereign. He looked up at her, his face etched with shame and vulnerability. That's who I really am, Maya, a fraud, a middle-aged man who obsessed over his former student. Maya was sobbing now, not from pity, but from the overwhelming beauty of his love. She moved from her chair to sit beside him on the sofa, cupping his face in her hands. "You beautiful, ridiculous man," she whispered through her tears. "Don't you see?" "See what?" "This isn't the evidence of a fraud. This is the evidence of the most profound, devoted, and honorable love I have ever known." He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What? You felt all of this powerful, all-consuming love, and you did nothing. You didn't act on it. You didn't put me in an impossible position. You chose to suffer in silence, to walk away from your entire life, to protect me. That's not pathetic, Alistair. That is the very definition of moral courage. But I obsessed. You loved me, even when you couldn't be with me. You kept me alive in your heart, in your writing. You celebrated my successes from afar. Her voice broke. You loved me when I didn't even know if I was worthy of being loved. He was staring at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. "I love you," she said, the words feeling as natural as breathing. "I love your terrible poetry and your secret journals and your beautiful, obsessive heart. I love you. I love you too," he whispered, the words sounding like a prayer he had waited a lifetime to speak. "I've loved you for 7 years. I think I'll love you for the rest of my life." They kissed then, and it was different from all their other kisses. It was a kiss of homecoming, of complete and total acceptance. There were no more walls, no more secrets. When they broke apart, they were both breathless and smiling through their tears. "Stay with me tonight?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of living in a memory." "Then yes," she said, her heart overflowing. "Of course I'll stay." He smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that lit up his entire face. "In that case, I should probably warn you. There are several more boxes of terrible poetry." "I can't wait," she said, kissing him again. "I can't wait to read every single word." They spent the rest of the night curled up on the sofa, going through his secret archive, laughing and crying and marveling at the strange parallel lives they had lived while they were apart. And when they finally made their way to his bedroom, it was not with the frantic urgency of long-denied passion, but with the slow, tender certainty of two souls who had finally, after a long and painful journey, found their way home. 6 months later, Maya was humming as she watered the plants in the fire escape of Alistair's apartment, their apartment. She had officially moved her life to Boston last month, trading her cramped New York studio for the sunlit, book-filled rooms she had come to call home. She found Alistair in his study, staring at his laptop screen with an expression of intense concentration. The study, once a place of solitary mourning, had become a shared space of creativity. Her laptop sat on the desk next to his, and her research books were happily commingling with his philosophy texts on the shelves. "Good morning, my love," she said, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind and kissing the top of his head. "Good morning," he said, his eyes still glued to the screen. "What has you so captivated?" "You won't believe it," he said, turning to her with a grin that made her heart do a little flip. "I just got an email from a publisher." Maya's eyes widened. "About the novel?" 3 months ago, after weeks of gentle but persistent encouragement, Maya had finally convinced him to send the first 3 chapters of his novel, the one that had started as a thinly veiled story about them, but had since evolved into a beautiful, sprawling narrative about second chances, to a literary agent she knew. "Not just about the novel," he said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "They want to publish it." Maya let out a squeal of pure joy and threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him out of his chair. "Alistair, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you. I knew this would happen. Your work is brilliant." "It's just a small independent press," he said, trying to temper his excitement, but failing miserably. "It's a beginning. It's validation. It's proof that you're not just a former professor or a quiet bookseller. You're a writer, a novelist." His eyes, the brilliant blue she loved so much, filled with tears. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Maya. You gave me the courage to even try." "You had the courage all along," she said softly. "You just needed someone to see it." They celebrated that night by opening a bottle of champagne and ordering takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. They sat on the floor of their living room, surrounded by books, and planned his future as a celebrated author. "I want to dedicate it to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion as they lingered over their empty cartons. "You don't have to do that. I want to. You're the reason this story even exists. You are the story." Maya reached across the makeshift table and took his hand. "What would the dedication say?" He smiled, a slow, beautiful smile. "I was thinking something simple. For M.A., who taught me that the best stories are the ones that begin with a second chapter." "It's perfect," she whispered. They spent the next few months in a happy whirlwind of edits and cover designs. Alistair came alive in a way Maya had never seen before. The process of shaping his novel, of preparing it for the world, seemed to heal the last of the wounds from his past. He was no longer a man in exile. He was a man who had found his true calling. The day the first advance copy of his book arrived, he held it in his hands with a look of pure reverence. The title was simple, The Second Chapter. On the cover was an elegant, artistic rendering of a dusty bookstore. "What if no one likes it?" he fretted, tracing the letters of his name on the cover. "People will love it," Maya said with absolute certainty. "And even if they don't, you will still have been brave enough to tell your truth. That's what matters." "When did you get to be so wise?" "I learned from the best ethics professor I ever had." He blushed. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" "Never. It's my favorite part of our story. Our very inappropriate story. Our very romantic story," she corrected. The book launch was held at the last chapter. The store was packed with friends, former colleagues from the university who had reconnected with Alistair, and loyal customers who had become his friends. Maya stood at the back of the crowded room, her heart swelling with pride as Alistair stood at a makeshift podium and read the first chapter of his novel aloud. His voice was strong and confident, the voice of a man who was finally comfortable in his own skin, in his own story. These weren't the secret, anguished words from his journal. These were words of hope, of resilience, of the redemptive power of a love that was brave enough to wait. After the reading, people crowded around him, asking him to sign their copies, telling him how much his story resonated with them. Maya hung back, content to watch him shine. She caught his eye across the room, and he gave her a small private smile that was meant only for her. An elegant older woman who Maya recognized as Dr. Eleanor Vance, his former mentor, approached her. "That was a beautiful reading," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling. "His story about finding love later in life. It feels so authentic, so deeply felt." "It comes from experience," Maya said with a smile. "The best ones always do." "Are you two married?" Eleanor asked, her gaze shifting between Maya and Alistair. Maya glanced over at Alistair, who was now talking to his publisher, his face animated with joy. "Not yet," she said, "but I'm with a wonderful man, a man who makes me believe in happy endings." Eleanor followed her gaze. "He's a lucky man. How long have you been together?" The question made Maya pause. How could she possibly quantify their time together? "Officially about a year," she said, "but I've been in love with him for 8. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. 8 years? Now that sounds like a story." "It is," Maya said. "We had to wait for the right time, the right chapter. But some things are worth waiting for." Later that night, after the last of the guests had gone and they had cleaned up the bookstore, they walked hand in hand through the quiet city streets. "I'm so proud of you," Maya said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You were brilliant tonight." "I was terrified." "You were brave," she corrected. "There's a difference." They stopped on their favorite bench in the public garden, the same one where she had first confronted him about his walls. The pond was frozen over, and the bare branches of the trees were dusted with a light, fresh snow. "Maya," Alistair said, turning to face her. His expression was serious, his blue eyes intense. "I need to ask you something." "Okay." He took a deep breath. "I know we haven't been together for very long in the grand scheme of things. I know we're still learning about each other, but I also know with a certainty that transcends all logic and reason that I do not want to spend another day of my life without you as my partner." Maya's heart started to pound. "Alistair, I'm not proposing, not exactly, not yet, but I am asking, would you consider it someday? The idea of building a life with me officially?" Tears sprang to her eyes. "Are you asking me if I want to marry you someday?" "I'm asking if you can imagine a future where we're not just partners, but a family, in every sense of the word." "Alistair Finch," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I have been imagining that future since I was 21 years old. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes. An absolute, unequivocal, forever yes. Whenever you're ready to ask properly." He laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply under the soft glow of the park lights. "I love you so much. I love you too. More than I ever thought was possible." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the sleeping city. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice muffled against his coat. "Now," he said, kissing the top of her head, "we live happily ever after. You really are a romantic. And you," he said, pulling back to look at her, his eyes shining, "are really worth waiting for." 2 years later, the dedication page of Alistair's second best-selling novel read simply, "For Maya, my wife, my love, my beginning, my middle, and my happy end." The book launch was held on a crisp October evening, exactly 3 years after Maya had first walked back into his life, their life. The bookstore was packed with friends and family, and their shared apartment was filled with the sounds of laughter and celebration. Alistair stood to read a passage from his new book, a story about the courage it takes to rewrite your own life. But first, he looked directly at Maya, who was standing in the front row, holding their 6-month-old daughter, Ella. "This last piece," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that everyone in the room could feel, is for the woman who changed my understanding of what it means to be brave. It's called The Right Question. For years, I thought my story was over. I lived in the quiet world of endings, of chapters closed and books shut. I thought the most important questions were the ones I found in dusty texts, questions of ethics and morality. I was wrong. The most important question was the one I was too afraid to ask and too afraid to answer. Then she walked back into my life, a force of nature disguised as a journalist, and she was not afraid. She asked the question, and in her asking, she gave me the courage to answer. And the answer was love. Not a simple love, but a complicated, messy, inconvenient, life-altering love. The kind of love that rewrites every page that came before it. Now, our house is filled with light and laughter and the sweet smell of a new baby. You laugh as I read you the terrible poems I wrote when I thought I had lost you forever, and I understand now that some stories don't end with a quiet closing of a door. Some stories begin with the courage to ask the right question, with the wisdom to know that some love is worth waiting for, with the faith that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun will rise again. This is our story. Not perfect, but true. Not easy, but worth everything. Not an ending, but a beginning, again and again, with every day we choose each other, without fear. The applause was thunderous. Alistair's eyes, full of love and gratitude, found hers across the crowded room. He smiled, the same smile that had captivated her in a lecture hall all those years ago, but brighter now, freer, full of a joy that was deep and true and hard-won. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down, Alistair and Maya stood on the front porch, watching the autumn leaves fall. Ella was sleeping soundly in her carrier on Maya's chest. "Good reading tonight," Maya said, squeezing his hand. "The best audience a man could ask for. Even better than your adoring students. Much better. This time I got to tell the truth." They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the world they had built together settle into a peaceful slumber. "Alistair," Maya said, turning to him. "Yes, I'm so glad I asked." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and their daughter. "Me too," he whispered into her hair. "It was the question that saved my life. Some love stories take 8 years to begin. Some take a lifetime to fully unfold. But the best ones, the ones that are worth waiting for, are the ones where love, in the end, wins. And this was, without a doubt, one of the very best."